Thank you everyone for coming this evening to our third presentation for the Seeds Fellows. We are excited that you're here. And our amazing presenter tonight is Dr. Faithe, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Black Studies Research. And I think everyone knows who I am. I'm Dr. Sharon Tediga, the director for the Center for Black Studies Research, and then Michael Cooper-Smith, who is our admin, is our everything at the center right now. He's doing a lot of work, and we appreciate all the work that he's doing. I just want to publicly say that. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Faith, for putting on the presentation this evening. And I'm going to disappear. I'm here in the background, but I will disappear. Hello, everyone out there. Glad to see you.
And I need to screen share. Okay, thank you all. Also, if you hear piano music, ignore that in the background. But as it was stated, my name is Faithe J. Day. In addition to being a postdoc at the Center for Black Studies Research, I'm sure that most of you know me as your discussion leader, research mentor, and guide here in the SEEDS program. And so in reference to a lot of the work that we have been doing in our biweekly discussions, today my talk is called Black Data Studies and the Legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois. And it's going to be a very exploratory talk, as I want to focus less on my own research and more on what I view as a subfield that is in development when it comes to taking more critical approaches to data science. So specifically, we will be exploring what I understand to be the history, methods, and future of taking a Black data approach to the study of media, information, and data science through three specific questions. With the first question being, what is Black data studies? How do I define it? But also, what does it mean for other scholars and researchers? And the second question is, why does Black data matter? To and for whom? And so for this question, I'm going to expand on the definition of Black data and historicize Black data studies through discussing why the study of Black data is significant and how it follows in the legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois and what is now known as the Data Portraits Project, as well as the Atlanta School of Sociology. And then I will end with an overview of research and institutes that are following in the footsteps of Du Bois, as well as a discussion of my own research to think about how data means for Black diasporic people, as well as how does one actually produce work that has or produces meaning for your specific community of study. But just starting off to question one, what is Black data studies and what do I mean when I use that term? And so overall, Black data studies is a field and a framework which is built on ethics, justice, and community mindedness. And because I really enjoy alliteration, Black data studies is also focused on pinpointing the interrelations between data collection, curation, curriculum, cultures, critique, and custodial models through the centering of Black diasporic people and communities. And generally, we can think about Black data studies as simply a critical approach to the study of data, which centers Black diasporic communities and people in the work, not only to produce research for research's sake, but to actually think about, create, and promote projects that have a use value for Black communities. And this could be as far reaching as partnering with community members on initiatives that are of interest to them, whether that be initiatives in the world of information and data, or just initiatives where research can be used to help that community. This could also be seen with doing things like co-constructing archives and even working on genealogy projects, which we've seen historically, or simply creating coursework that is critically informed by Black data. Overall, I feel there are many ways to do this type of work, and I will discuss some of them today within the context of this presentation. But first, and think about doing work that is centered on a particular community. For some, there is this question of why? Why Black data? Why not all data? So I wanted to also address and articulate what Black data is, why Black data in particular matters, and even more so why it matters to me as a scholar who is invested in sort of the intersection of identity and culture. And in the essay, Black Data, ethnographer and scholar Shaka McGlatton states that when thinking about the study of data, and especially in our current era of data being produced and aggregated for the purpose of capitalist gain by tech companies and social media platforms, Black data work understands that assigning numerical or financial value to Black life, transforming experience into information or data is nothing new. Rather, it is caught up with the history of enslavement and the racist regimes that sought to justify its barbarities. And one of the reasons that I truly enjoy McGlatton's work on the digital, and specifically this understanding of Black data, is that many of us tend to position data science and even digital studies as these new spaces of inquiry that are in some way not burdened by or perhaps disconnected from the past. However, while the information era and the move into a more digital world has created quote unquote new technologies, there is nothing new about a lot of what we are seeing, especially in this time when it comes to Black data. And I think in particular for this talk, focusing on the uses and gratifications of data and technology, and especially the uses and gratifications of the collection and analysis of big data. And this concern about how certain data practices and methods can reproduce histories of harm and trauma, especially from social media platforms and other technologies that we use on a day-to-day basis, was the impetus behind my creation of the Black Living Data booklet. And so pictured here, the Black Living Data booklet, or the BLDB, is a manual and a manifesto on the ethical engagement of data on and for Black communities. And for those that are interested in a more in-depth exploration of the booklet, you can find the project on my website, as well as a part of other collaborative digital projects, such as the Visualizing the Virus project, which is a curation of different writings which are focused on COVID-19. But for this presentation, I want to focus on the portion of the booklet which explores the history of data collection, with a focus on the collection of data on and about Black communities. Because what I and many other scholars know is that there is a long history of research on Black communities in which an individual or an institution goes into that community and begins extracting data from community members instead of thinking about how to give back to them. And I tend to see this big data extraction happening in 4 different areas across time, which I cover within the booklet. And so the first area that we see is the area of researchers and their institutions who collect all types of data, depending on the field, which result in different communities of study. And historically, we have seen research from the scientific racism of the 17th and 18th centuries, all the way until sociological narratives about the culture of poverty, incarceration and criminality, as well as the effects of single-parent families, which portray the struggles of Black communities, but tend to leave out the nuance, complexity, and many times the actual voices and lived experiences of the people who are being discussed and represented by this research. These research practices are also common when it comes to government entities who many times use research, especially institutional research, to reinforce deficit narratives through the creation of policy or legislation. So for example, when researchers collect statistics on crime in Black communities, which depicts certain neighborhoods as more dangerous than others. Those statistics can then be used to justify laws like stop and frisk, with neither of those things recognizing the role that stereotypes, discrimination, and the history of over-policing of Black communities actually plays into the creation of the crime rates in the first place. And this is one of the biggest issues with data on Black communities, as systemic racism not only plays a role in the collection and analysis of data, but also the mere existence of certain types of data and how it is used. And the third example that we see a lot of data extraction from within Black communities historically is from medical institutions. And this particular example, I think that we're all seeing a lot of right now within the era of COVID-19, especially when we started to see discourse and conversations about Black community members who were dealing with either not wanting to take the COVID-19 vaccine or being targeted by COVID-19 misinformation. And this is partly because, since the era of slavery, all the way into things like the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, and even the case of Henrietta Lacks and the creation of HeLa cells, there is a knowledge that healthcare institutions and practitioners have not always been good to Black communities. And so for many Black community members, there is a bit of a chilling effect when it comes to medical institutions. And this is also why, conversely, that we have things like institutional review boards, because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of how information and data was either collected, stored, analyzed, even visualized in ways that were highly problematic, if not illegal, and that reinforced narratives which pathologize Black people and other them from a sense of human beingness. And so we see this even now, where you have a history of Black people who have been the subjects of horrific scientific experiments, because there is a discourse in medicine that Black people don't feel pain the way other people do, which is once again a holdover from the era of scientific racism, in which Black people were not viewed as wholly human, but in some way subhuman. And the fourth example, which is more recent, and I think is what people even think more so of in the study of information and data, and something that I explore more of in my own work, is technology companies, and in particular, the discriminatory design inherent in many platforms and technologies that we use on a day-to-day basis. So from cameras and facial recognition software that can't recognize Black skin, to recommendation systems which hide the content of Black creators while promoting content creators who copied them, there are multiple issues with how technology reinforces these histories of oppression, but also how the algorithms which collect information and data actually work against Black community members in a number of ways, which I will speak a little bit more about on the latter half of the presentation. But knowing that sort of very brief data history, we can then see why a culturally informed study of Black data is important in so many ways and for so many individuals. But it especially matters for the communities that have been oppressed and marginalized by racist and discriminatory practices of data collection and analysis. And in light of this history, Black data really matters for establishing frameworks for liberatory and anti-racist, sexist, ableist, any type of research that is focused on a social justice or ethically oriented practice. And this is especially important to a lineage of scholars and practitioners that are committed to a critical data study. And in creating that lineage of scholarship, I think it is also important for the study of Black data to not center the lineage of Black data collection that comes from more oppressive regimes, but through a data history that begins with work that was actually critical in the collection of information and data from the very beginning. And so I give the example of W.E.B. Du Bois, who is, if you do not know, a very influential figure within Black history, as well as within sociology and African American studies. But Du Bois was aware in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that the way that data was being collected by researchers was not culturally informed, and that it was being extractive and reinforcing stereotypes and negative cultural beliefs about the Black community. And in particular, Du Bois's focus on Black American life. And so while he was a professor in Atlanta, Georgia, Du Bois went around the state of Georgia with his own students and actually collected data on African Americans, asking the questions that he felt weren't being asked. And then him and his students created these beautiful hand-drawn visualizations of that data, which demonstrated what Du Bois hadn't been seeing in the deficit narratives being put forth by other researchers, which was a narrative of the potential and the mobility of Black Americans in spite of the legalized inequality that Black people were facing at that time. And so as a reflection on this work, in the book, W.E.B. Du Bois's Data Portraits, Whitney Battle Baptiste and Britt Reser write about Du Bois's sociological work in Atlanta when he took these data visualizations and findings to the 1900 Paris exhibit. And in the book, the authors write that the infographics look back to a history of data visualization in the 19th century, deeply connected to the institution of slavery and the struggle against it, while looking forward. And this was especially interesting to me because I like to think of many moments in Black history as moments where certain figures were engaging in their own form of speculative design or Afrofuturistic thought. For example, when MLK had a dream, that is an example of speculative imagining or a design thinking of what the future could be, which then eventually came to pass. And the same could be said of Du Bois's visualizations, which act as incredibly accurate visions of what data and design would look like in the future. And this imagining about the future of science and technology was, of course, the norm for Du Bois because he actually wrote speculative fiction in his free time. And much of scientific and or speculative fiction is focused on doing the work of taking what you know about the past and the present to project or envision the possibilities of the future. And this looking back and looking forward is also described in the book, W.E.B. Du Bois's Data Portraits, as a method of framing, which presents us, quote, with a stunning juxtaposition that points neither to historical progress nor to the overcoming of the slave past, but to the ways that slavery continued to quite literally frame the present, end quote. And so once again, building on the concept of Black data, we can still envision the many ways in which the legacy of slavery frames the collection and analysis of data in both the 20th and 21st centuries. From medical apartheid to racist AI, the moments in which Black people are framed as data points instead of individuals tends to recreate these spaces where we see history repeating itself, even in an instance or even in a space where there's an expectation of social progress or technological advancement. So this is why I tend to view Du Bois's work as the model or the framework for what it means to do Black studies research. From Du Bois and the data portraits, it is apparent that when you are collecting information and data on Black communities, you must first either create relationships with Black community members or have some familiarity with the community or the topics that you want to study. And so doing that participatory design work, instead of coming into a community as a stranger, it's really important to actually work to build bonds and to give back in some way. The second thing is including Black cultural expression in the work that you do. And so many people discuss data portraits as this prototype of data visualization before we had the software to do that work. And Baptiste and Risserk describe it as an example of the intersection of both visual art and social science, which demonstrated how data could be made more accessible to the populations of people from which the data actually is being collected. And so I think any Black data studies work should also be focused on including both art and activism within the work itself, especially when presenting information and data, either through visuals or methods of data storytelling, which make the work accessible and also somewhat speculative, or even invested in change and forward movement. And this is why I think we can also see Du Bois's work as an early example of what might be called data science for social good, which actually privileges collaboration and cooperation within a community, or even within the community members of the other people that you work with in an institution, over more traditional institutional models which privilege individualism and impact. And in this sense, Black data studies does not just replicate or produce work without question. This type of research must also be self-reflective by critiquing the role of the researcher and also the tools that we use to do research. So instead of assuming that technology is value neutral or objective, or even that data science tools are inherently objective, actually questioning whether our positionality or our tools are also recreating harm in some way. And if so, what can we actually do to redress or remunerate those harms? And this brings me to my final question, question 3, which is, how does data mean for Black diasporic people? In the case of Du Bois's work, he was seeing and reading the research about African Americans that was being produced, and it just didn't sound right to him. And this was because the data wasn't telling what he knew to be the truth of the community. It wasn't getting at that deeper why question when it came to the way that inequality was being analyzed in the research. So in thinking about how to get at that question, in doing Black data studies work, I really enjoy this tweet from Dr. Blair Kelly, who's a professor of history. And in this tweet, she states that some folks really don't know that Black people have our own internal world that we value, our own institutions, our own ways of thinking about the world. We aren't using the same measuring stick to think about our lives. Hashtag Black folk. And for me, this statement really gets at the thing that Du Bois wasn't seeing and what compelled him to do his own research. And I believe what has compelled many scholars to do their work is doing research that takes note of the fact that there is a different measuring stick and that the study of data is not a one-size-fits-all approach, that there are different values for different communities, and in many ways, it is devaluing a community to assert a method or a theory that isn't actually relevant when studying that group. Yet, despite this knowledge, we do see this a lot within data science research, which doesn't delve deep into the nuances of culture or that isn't critically interrogating difference, which is why in my own research, I always have this question in the back of my head, which is, what would media studies, data studies, or even science and technology studies look like if the experiences of intersectionally marginalized individuals were centered in that scholarship? What approaches to the study of data could be developed if there was less of a focus on universalizing our understanding of technologies and how we live and interact within a technologically focused world? And at this moment in time, we are very lucky to be seeing a surge in researchers, departments, and organizations who have taken up this call to do work that is centering Black diasporic communities when it comes to information, data, and digital technologies. Organizations like Data for Black Lives, which is a group of activists, organizers, and mathematicians committed to the mission of using data science to create concrete and measurable change in the lives of Black people. And this collective hosts conferences around many of the questions that face critical data scientists and practitioners who are thinking about the relationship between activism and data research, which I believe is essentially the purpose of any Black data studies framework. And then we're also seeing this work within institutional spaces as well, both new spaces and more established spaces, such as the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab, Left of Black with Mark Anthony Neal, and even the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State, and the intersection of African American Studies and Digital Humanities at the University of Maryland. This investment in Black data is also displayed in scholarship, which represents the interdisciplinary nature of Black studies and the multi-method analysis of Black culture and community. From Sophia Noble's work on algorithms of oppression to Kara Keeling's imaginings of Black queer futures, Black data studies is expansive enough to include more technical discussions of hardware and software, all the way to considerations of culture and creative works. And as the SEEDS program and many other programs have shown, there is great potential in moving Black studies towards work that is more focused on data and the digital. And because I enjoy visualizations and mapping, this is my rendering of the specific fields and names that people have given to the type of Black data studies work that I described. And so while I tend to view most things under this really large heading of Black digital studies, there are also people like Ruha Benjamin who call their work critical race, science, and technology studies, or even those that do the work of critical data studies or critical data science, which does not focus on Black communities solely, but I feel has the capacity to also be inclusive of this type of work. And you also see here things like Black digital humanities, Black code studies, e-Black studies, Black cyberfeminism. There are many names by which this sort of Black data studies work is understood and enveloped. And while I keep updating my own scholarly identity, I also exist, I feel, in a couple of these points, especially the ones which connect digital humanities to Black digital studies. So in addition to my work on the Black Living Data Project, currently I'm working on various projects which speak to the shift towards more inclusion of Black data or Black digital studies. But I'm only going to mention a summary of that work to make a few final points. And so as some of you may know, much of my research is examining the performance of race, gender, sexuality, class, ability, and whatever other identity markers come up within online commenting communities. And I primarily analyze data from social media sites such as YouTube, TikTok, and even Tumblr to ask questions about how individuals are performing their identity, and in many ways, how the internet acts as a space to bring communities together through sharing. And in doing this work, I've also begun to argue for a recognition that when you are working with the data of intersectionally marginalized communities, most of the time that work will be engaged with small data. And many times within data science, there is an obsession with big data, which tends to reflect a cis heteronormative understanding of both science and technology. Specifically, in the book Data Feminism, the authors describe BDD projects as projects which ignore context, fetishize size, and inflate their technical and scientific capabilities. This obsession with big data is also referenced in work by Jen Jack King in the article Size Matters to Lesbians Too, which is all about working with the small data of queer archives. And this argument for small data is especially important to me because what I tend to find, especially when people study online phenomena, is that it's always about the popular, the trending, what has the most views, and in this sense, the biggest set of data. However, this constant search for statistical significance and greater power only continues to marginalize and silence communities and conversations which are not large enough to reach that level of significance or even public recognition. Which is why I recently worked on a collaborative article in Social Media and Society titled Platforming Intersectionality, Network Solidarity and the Limits of Platform Power, to discuss the value of small data centered around particular communities. Because many times when the main focus is the mainstream or what is popular, smaller groups like Black, queer, and trans people get left out of this move towards doing data science projects, as well as analyzing how these communities are engaging with technology. Especially as mainstream television and film are not always the most diverse and inclusive spaces for content creation. Most of my research focuses on indie television and web series, especially community-produced platforms, one of which I have noted here, OpenTV, and archives of Black and queer content. And many times these archives and networks are created in response to the discriminatory design inherent within the algorithms undergirding different social media platforms. And so while much of my research has focused on the way that platforms such as TikTok and YouTube make content creation more difficult for Black and LGBTQIA creators, through a focus on the algorithmic underpinnings of these sites, I'm also thinking about the way that these platforms are working to become more inclusive of Black communities. And specifically, over the past few years, YouTube has recently started to create their own events, such as YouTube Black, which are targeted towards Black fans and content creators. YouTube Black is an especially interesting example of this shift because it began after a 2015 article titled "YouTube Rarely Promotes Black YouTube Stars, Even During Black History Month," which was written by journalist and YouTuber Akilah Hughes, who's pictured here. And this article, of course, is referencing Kanye West's infamous "George Bush doesn't care about Black people" statement after the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. In the article, Hughes actually calls out YouTube's lack of diverse representation in the promotion and recognition of its content creators. And specifically, Hughes does this by actually conducting an informal quantitative content analysis of YouTube's official Twitter account during February of 2015, from which she found that during Black History Month, the company produced only 15 tweets about Black YouTubers in contrast to 167 tweets promoting white creators, many with smaller, more niche followings. And in addition, even of the 15 tweets that came from Black YouTubers, most of them actually came from people who were already Black celebrities. And so almost a year later, on March 31st, 2016, YouTube selected 100 Black content creators to be flown out to an event titled #YouTubeBlack. As a response to multiple criticism around YouTube's failure to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, both within and outside of the site. And so specifically actually citing the original Hughes article, YouTube CEO Susan Wojcicki confirmed on stage that Hughes' article had circulated internally at Google and stated that the company wanted to make right a situation that was a clear break from their values. And so Hughes also writes in her article that #YouTubeBlack marked the first time a major social media platform had directly in person addressed the plight of being Black online and sought out ways to support this dynamic and growing demographic. Through creating a series of workshops, mentoring sessions, critical reflection, and plans for how to navigate the specific plight of being Black on YouTube, the event was lauded as an important and necessary step in the right direction. And since the inaugural 2016 YouTube Black, the event has been replicated and expanded each year, with the inaugural event being hosted in California, where the Google headquarters and many of YouTube's offices and studios are located. The 2017 event was held in Washington, D.C. The event has also morphed from a space where YouTube executives listen to the demands of Black YouTube content creators into a space where content creators have chosen to give back to the community and their fan base. And one of the ways that this has actually been happening is through hosting YouTube Black at and during well-known HBCU homecomings. Specifically, historically Black colleges and universities like Howard and even Spelman and Morehouse have all hosted YouTube Black events. And hosting these events at HBCUs is very intentional on the part of YouTube because HBCUs are spaces of Black cultural significance, especially within the world of media and culture. And so by utilizing these Black cultural signifiers, as well as inviting well-known Black YouTubers and celebrities to the events, there is a question about who is and is not seen as being part of the Black YouTube community. In creating these events and hosting them at HBCU homecomings, YouTube has created a very specific image of what this event is and who it's for, which doesn't include those content creators who do not have large followings and or Black fans and creators who don't have access to these spaces. So as exciting as YouTube Black is, from my dissertation research, I had learned to be a bit skeptical about how YouTube and therefore Google operates when it comes to diversity work and being inclusive of marginalized communities. So I decided to begin collecting comments from Twitter and YouTube about the event, as well as compiling videos referencing the first YouTube Black and the annual events which followed. Through a mixed method analysis of YouTube video content, online comment sections, and tweets under the #YouTube Black, I began asking the question, what is the relationship between YouTube Black and the concept of a Black YouTube? And who/what decides the parameters of inclusion or exclusion from both of those spaces? And what I have found so far is, despite Google publicly acknowledging that YouTube's corporate promotion of content in spaces such as Twitter and the algorithmic underpinnings of the platform working against marginalized communities, the corporate agenda of #YouTube Black has morphed the movement from a day for recognizing all Black content creators to a week-long pseudo event that primarily promotes the YouTube platform and what I call Black YouTube celebrities. And pseudo events or media events are essentially events that are created for the purposes of generating some type of publicity. And so in many ways, this is what YouTube Black does now for YouTube. And so specifically thinking about the distinction then between YouTube Black as a movement for Black YouTubers and this kind of hashtag YouTube Black that the company has created tracks how a movement can actually be co-opted and turned into a mediated spectacle, which on one hand lives up to the promotion and recognition that Black YouTubers wanted, but technically is only being promoted because it promotes the platform itself. In the sense, it's promoting the YouTube more than the aspect of it being about Black content creators. And especially as online platforms like YouTube act as spaces of recognition and representation for marginalized communities, this project reinforces the importance of community and culture, both within and outside of corporate platforms, by questioning the intent and purpose of corporations creating place and space for those communities to gather. I think this project is actually also a reflection of the difference between working with communities in more extractive ways versus in a generative way. And so while YouTube Black began as a means of giving back to community members, in many ways, the event is now a way for YouTube to capitalize on Black content creators without actually helping those who really need assistance in growing their channels. And this is something that we saw a lot of within social media, especially last year, during the summer where there was a rise in social justice movements. You saw many platforms, not just YouTube, sort of using the space of social justice movements to then kind of promote their own content and promote things that were happening within their platforms. And so YouTube was definitely one of the spaces that did that. So by leveraging the large platforms of creators and celebrities that are already popular on the site, YouTube in this sense then engages in the fetishization of size that we see with this concern for big data when it comes to how they choose to value Black content and the spread of information and data on Black communities. So instead of YouTube Black being this event that's actually uplifting smaller content creators and individuals who don't have as much of a platform and actually could really use the help from the platform, they're choosing to use hashtag YouTube Black to promote creators who already have a large following. So essentially those creators are just ensuring that YouTube gets promoted and not really getting the same amount of benefits as it would be if it was for a smaller creator. And so something that I've been thinking about as well with this project is, what would it mean then to reclaim YouTube Black for its original purpose, to support Black content creators who don't feel supported from the site and who don't feel like they actually get recognition because of the way that their algorithm works. And so this is a question that I'm considering moving forward. But overall, and to conclude, I wanted to also leave you with some final questions to consider when thinking about doing Black data studies work, and also in reflection on the work that I've shared, which are as follows. The first question, is bigger always better? And so when we are doing data science work, when we're doing different types of projects, or even when we're deciding on what it is that we want to study, how can we not only value big data in our conversations around information and data science, but also the importance of small data within the field? And then the second question that I had was thinking about the process of collecting data. And so when you are collecting data, what are the expectant or imagined outcomes for the data that you're collecting and for whom? And I think especially when you are doing community-based work, there is an importance in imagining the potential of what that data collection is going to do for that community, either for the good or for the bad, and using that to think about whether or not you should be doing that project and what the use of that project is. And so in this sense, thinking about, what or who is actually benefiting from the data that you're collecting or the archives that you are creating. Is it going to actually be beneficial? And if it's not going to be beneficial, then what are the reasons why you're doing that work? And then another question, and thinking about who benefits and who does not benefit, is if you are working with community-based data, then also having that system of accountability in the work are you doing. So whether that be your personal feelings of accountability to a community, so thinking about how would you develop your personal research ethics and your positionality in doing data research, but also thinking about, are there other systems of accountability that you have sort of outside of yourself that you can use in the collection and analysis of data? And thinking then too about the sort of differences between sort of Black data work as it relates to work in other aspects of information and data science, also imagining what are potentially new ways of evaluating this type of work if they're doing something different than other types of projects. How do we evaluate not only data science work, but data science work that is more critical, ethical, and socially just? And then the final question I have when thinking about doing data work, especially Black data work, is making sure that you're always aware of whether the data is driving the idea that you have for a project or whether the idea is driving the data. And so being sort of critically aware and reflective about your sort of a priori assumptions, your beliefs about particular communities, and how that might be influencing the type of projects that you want to do. So even in thinking about a social good project, in doing something that is socially good for a community, is there a presumption that you have that that community needs help in some way? And why do you have that presumption? Is that something that the community told you, or is that an assumption that you just have because of maybe stereotypes about that group? So really critiquing and analyzing not only why you're doing the work, but what that says about what you potentially think about that community.
I'm not sure if other people are having a problem, but Faith has frozen. Oh, there you go. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. So at this time, again, thank you, Dr. Day. That was a wonderful presentation that you provided. Now it's time for the Q&A. And what I would like to do is stop the recording at this point because we said we would not record the Q&A sessions, and the rest of this to be available for others to watch. And again, thank you so much for your amazing presentation on Black data studies. Okay, let me stop the recording now. Thank you. And questions, please.